Welcome. This is Chapter 48 in Raven et al. Biology, 10th edition, if you're following along. And in this chapter, we're going to learn how animals oxygenate their bodies, how they support the systems that they actually do that with, what are the difficulties they face, and how do they exploit physical properties of diffusion to help them. All right, and let's start the lecture with a couple of reading assessment questions, assuming you've done so. Oxygen diffusion is related to, select all of the answers that apply in this case. You should have selected all of these. So oxygen diffusion is related to pressure, it's related to surface area of the thing that it's diffusing across, and the distance across which it has to diffuse. How about this one? Unidirectional flow of air in the lungs would be nice, but has not evolved in any group. This, of course, is false. Diapsids, especially birds and crocodilians, have done a very good job of adapting lungs to provide unidirectional flow of material. So you will see this as we move into the lecture, but unidirectional flow of air is possible in lungs. How about this one? As blood moves around the body, I should say around the body at rest, does it unload most, some, almost none of its O2, or a highly variable amount of O2? Of course, the answer B here is the best. We're dealing with a body at rest, so it unloads just some of the O2 it carries. Oxygen, and this is a very interesting book on your left here that you see, and if you have a chance, I'd recommend it. It's a book that deals with oxygen, its origins on the surface of the Earth, and the importance of it within the biosphere. We know, of course, from earlier lectures that oxygen is actually a byproduct that was generated early by cyanobacteria that had a major effect on the direction of life on the surface of the Earth. And if you study it, you'll find out that it also had a really important element in protecting Earth's atmosphere. So, as a reminder, this is chapter 48 in the Raven et al. Biology book. And I want you to understand these components when you're done. There's some obvious ones in here. Why is O2 important? Why do animals need O2 to survive? Explain how they actually get it, and explain how it's transported around the body, especially as it relates to pH. All right, so again, we already talked about oxygen already, but here we are again talking about it, and it is important to understand then why we need to talk about it so often. If you remember back to the protist lecture, I talked about the fact that protists are not particularly well suited to oxygen. In fact, one of the reasons that they may have picked up mitochondria was as a protection to deal with high oxygen levels that were appearing in the atmosphere. And that these bacteria went on to produce enormous amounts of energy and allowed protists to diversify in ways that they weren't able to before, and that ultimately produced some of the very complex multicellular organisms that we have today. So if that is the case, if our earliest ancestors were probably not in need of oxygen, so these were protists that probably lived in an anaerobic world and probably did quite well there, why do we need it now? And then the reason for this, and you'll see this as we move forward, is exactly the reason that oxygen, it turns out, is so dangerous. So look to your right here. This, of course, is a common phenomenon that people are very familiar with, but this is a rusted sheet of iron. The iron that is not fully rusted yet has that sort of metallic gray color, but iron will easily rust with oxygen and forms that dark reddish color. And the reason I selected iron will be more obvious as we move forward in the lecture. But think about that iron, which is a pretty stable metal, is attacked at room temperature by the amount of oxygen that's just bumping in it from the air. That's a very aggressive reaction. It's happening all the time. And the fact that oxygen is able to convert iron to iron oxide so easily suggests that iron is a very reactive molecule. And this is going to be a theme associated around oxygen. Oxygen is always reacting with things, and because of that, it's very, very dangerous because it can react with things you don't want it to, and it can damage systems. On the other hand, oxygen reacting with things aggressively means that there's a lot of energy potentially released by the oxygenation of materials. So oxygen is an oxidizer, right? And no, I did not have to spend 10 years in school to find that out. But I want you to take a look on the left here. This is an MSDS from oxygen. You can see that the 3 different colored diamonds are present. It's got 2 zeros, okay, so it's not very reactive in those categories, but it has a 3 in that blue category, and I don't really care that you understand why or what it means, but remember the highest rating is a 4. 3s are considered dangerous. They are considered dangerous at normal benchtop, and they should be treated with care. The fact that there's additionally that marker down in the white box, that's a special hazard concern. It means that the hazard is not well represented in the other 3 boxes, as 3 colored boxes, and that there's additional safety concerns. So oxygen is actually quite a reactive molecule. If you are ever dealing with transport of gaseous oxygen, which comes in those big pressurized tanks, you have to be careful not just because it's in a pressurized tank, but because the oxygen itself can react with things. And in fact, when you go to areas that will deal with oxygen in pressurized tanks, you will notice that the areas where they do unloading is always concrete. And that's because if oxygen, that liquid oxygen, actually spilled out onto asphalt, could actually catch the road on fire because it would react so strongly with that on certain times of the year. Would not be as likely in, say, the winter, but actually could react almost immediately in the summertime. So it's actually quite a dangerous compound. This is an issue for us because it means that it's constantly reacting with things, right? And it binds very strongly to material it reacts with. So that is both useful and concerning depending on which item it actually binds to. And when oxygen binds to things, it does a very good job of drawing electrons towards itself. So poor little hydrogen, if it binds to an oxygen, becomes very much unshielded, which means that all of the electrons that were circling hydrogen suddenly spend far more time circling the oxygen and spend much less time circling the hydrogen, hence the reason that you can have things like hydrogen bonds. Now, at the cellular level, this can cause real issues because it means that things like proteins will be damaged by oxygen, it means that lipid bilayers will be damaged by oxygen, and it means that cells have to be very strict about the amount of oxygen levels that they tolerate in the body. So your body is very well tuned to maintain oxygen at actually fairly low levels. Even though you're breathing regularly, and you do need oxygen, especially your brain is very dependent on getting lots of oxygen, the amount of oxygen that's actually in your body at any one time is not very high. Okay, and oxygen is actually very useful in the immune system. It turns out the immune system uses oxygen and oxygen radicals to attack bacteria, in part because they are so aggressive at damaging compounds that it's very difficult to evolve structures that are resistant to it. You just have to evolve structures that will be damaged, but that you can replace. So it's a system that is very useful for damaging lots of different types of pathogens. So oxygen can be dangerous, but one thing it does do is it allows us to generate a lot of energy in the body. Because if you're moving large bodies, for instance, this whale again, it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of energy that goes into moving that body. And the same is actually true of this powerboat that's right in front of the whale. That powerboat is actually dependent on a reaction that also requires oxygen. So to move that large boat or the large whale, you really do need a lot of oxygen around. And if it takes a lot of oxygen, right, we know that it's reactive, then we have a lot of energy we can extract out of the system. And you know that because in POB1 you covered the Krebs cycle, and you know that the Krebs cycle is far more efficient at generating ATP, which is a currency of energy, right? It's a measure of how much you're extracting from something, as opposed to, say, fermentation, right? Fermentation, by contrast, is the poor second brother to the Krebs cycle. You just don't generate nearly as much energy from it as you do when you do oxidative reaction in the Krebs cycle. So the evolution of large animal bodies is probably limited by the amount of O2 that's in here I say in the air, but it's really the amount of O2 in the environment and the air is representative of that, right? O2 dissolved in water is directly related to how much is available in the air, and the amount that's available in the air is directly related to, in our world, to the amount that primary producers have been able to generate and that have saturated the environment with. O2 levels do change over geologic time. They won't change, let's say, in your lifetime, but O2 levels will change over the course of geologic time. And as you remember, the death and dying that was associated probably with the emergence of O2 as a common atmospheric molecule released a lot of things and caused huge changes in the biosphere. And that opened up huge opportunities, not least of which for this budding and small group of things which ultimately became animals. So death and dying and extinction in one part of the world produces opportunities for many things later. One thing I keep returning to, and I would like you to understand this, is that approximately 500 million years ago, we call that the Cambrian explosion, there is good evidence to suggest that all of the animal body plans that we see today on the surface of the Earth had evolved at almost that exact moment. So they appear very suddenly in the fossil record. And well, the interesting thing about that is not that those organisms necessarily appeared, but the rapidity at which the body plans appeared is very short, but we know that the groups are much, much older. So for instance, echinoderms clearly have a much older history than the Cambrian explosion appears to suggest. But their body plans are really cemented during the Cambrian explosion. Annelids are the same way, the earthworms, right? Their body plans are really cemented in the Cambrian explosion, but they actually extend quite a bit further back, probably back to something like the very early origins of oxygen on the surface of the Earth. And one thing that this recent paper has come out and suggested is that the availability of oxygen, especially as it relates to shallow marine environments where these systems are evolving, was probably really important in producing the timing and tempo of biodiversity of radiations at this time. So it's probably almost directly in response to a very large rise, a spike in oxygen that appears at this point that allows complex organisms to suddenly develop really complex and large body plans. And then these body plans, because they're all being pitted against each other, ultimately end up with a range of different successful strategies, but those successful strategies seem to be about it for us, right? We've picked up very few different body plans since then. Again, it's a Cambrian explosion. So if I ask you when did most animal body plans appear on the surface of the Earth, that would be about 500 million years ago. To give you some idea, about 250 million years ago is right around the earliest first dinosaurs. 65 is really the rise of mammals. And of course, humans or hominids, I should say hominids, are on the order of just a couple, just very few couple million years, not very long at all. So the appearance of oxygen is really important to support those big bodies that we see in later animals. And when I say big bodies here, I'm talking about millimeters to centimeters to maybe upwards of a meter. That doesn't seem huge, but keep in mind that if you'd been in the ocean prior to that, the vast majority of things that you had been looking at were less than a millimeter long, right? Bacteria and protists. So the fact that these bodies are now starting to get larger than, say, a couple of millimeters long is a huge change. All right, so O2, clearly we need that. It powers these large bodies that we have. But if you use O2, of course, you should also remember that you have to get rid of CO2. So look at this reaction I have listed over here. This is a very simplified version of a reaction of a sugar with oxygen, right? It can be converted into CO2 and H2O. And that's what animals and heterotrophs do, right? So they break down. And the reverse reaction, CO2 and H2O converted into a sugar and some oxygen, is done by primary producers when they have access to, in the case of plants, things like sunlight. But again, remember, there are chemosynthetic autotrophs, so they can use chemical energy to actually synthesize. But in any case, they always use carbon and hydrogen of some kind, and many of them will produce oxygen as a byproduct of that. And so those reactions are constantly going backwards and forwards. and you're playing your part to break down those sugars. Now, CO2 is a material that we make, right? We make a lot of it. And CO2 has to be expelled from our body. Right? We don't want to keep, we can't just let it build up in us. So we do have to control it. One of the important things about CO2 that we have to be aware of is that CO2 actually does react with water spontaneously. It follows this reaction. And what you'll see here is the CO2 and H2O will occasionally react and they make an acid. That acid will dissociate. It can do it a couple of times, so it has a lot of hydrogen on it. And as it's dissociating, it's releasing a lot of hydrogen atoms, which makes something more and more acidic. So animals will tend to break things down and make things acidic. So when you taste rotten, let's say you leave something out on the counter, and then you taste it, right? And you go, oh, it's rotten. It often has a sour flavor. And what your body is detecting is that lower pH environment. So the heterotrophs are breaking something down. Conversely, plants, because they're going to do the opposite, are actually going to make things more basic. We're not going to talk about that here, but you can measure that very easily with things like pH meters. Let's talk a little bit about this guy now. So this is something that it was discovered in the 1800s. O2 will enter the body, so we do need it, and we're going to need to rely to some degree on diffusion. Now, diffusion is a passive process, right? So the amount of O2 moving around the body is going to be done just passively. And that means that O2 in the body is going to go from high concentrations to low concentrations, right? There's going to be a gradient. Where there's high concentrations of O2, those are going to tend to diffuse towards low concentrations, right? And you've seen this many, many times before. If you have high concentrations of salt on one side, you'll tend to have it diffuse to a low concentration unless there's some barrier. So that was nerves, right? Same thing with water. Where there's a high concentration of water, it will tend to diffuse to the lower concentration of water, right? So the book is going to point out that there's this equation, this R equals dA delta P over D, and that's fine. That's a mathematical way of denoting this. But in fact, what it's saying is very, very simple. Diffusion is related to the difference between two areas, the area that those things interact with, the distance they have to cross, right, and the type of molecule. Since we're only going to be talking about it related to O2, then we don't have to worry about type of molecule because it's always the same. So if you were to simplify that and say it in another way, you could basically say surface area to volume ratio is important to the relationship and how you diffuse O2 around the body, which you already know. We've covered this many times. If you have a lot of surface area and a low volume, it'll be very easy to diffuse things into you. If, on the other hand, you have a very low surface area and a huge volume, as your body tends to, right? You don't actually have that much surface area for your volume. Then it's actually very hard to get oxygen to all your tissues. So, for instance, you cannot passively rely on diffusion, just crossing all the surfaces of your body, to supply your whole body with oxygen. But if you are not going to do that, then you have to worry about how do you get oxygen into the body and how do you get CO2 out, because we don't want to build up acids within our body. So let's think about what we're dealing with. When I say diffusion, how far can we diffuse? What's the distances that we cannot? So you can expect that O2 will diffuse up to 0.5 millimeter. Now take a look at this here. These are some sizes of arteries. You can see capillaries and then veins. At the top here, this 4,000, 1,000, 30, 20, 8, and 1. Those are the sizes in micrometers. So you can divide that by 1,000 and you'll get it into millimeters. That those particular things are. And what you can see is by the time you get to an arteriole or even an artery, right, there's no way. You cannot even diffuse oxygen out of an artery. So arteries are effectively tubes that do not allow oxygen to escape. Really, where you're going to do most of your exchanging is in your capillary. By the time it reaches a vein, most of the oxygen will have been exchanged, and you can't even get it out of these large veins. There's no way. So the vast majority of diffusion can only occur at the capillary beds. Okay, so when you think about back to that circulation chapter, there's lots of arteries and lots of veins in the body, and yet those are really not supplying oxygen directly. They're supplying it indirectly by allowing the tubing to be connecting and allowing these systems to function, but they themselves are not allowing oxygen to diffuse out of them. In fact, arteries are so thick that they actually have to have capillaries run through them and around them to supply them with enough oxygen to keep them supported. They would actually starve because they're so thick, in fact, that oxygen simply can't even diffuse to support the artery alone. So capillaries are about the only place we can do that. If, on the other hand, you say, I'm just going to allow diffusion to get me all of my solution, I'm not going to even bother with this, what you would find is it takes far too long to move oxygen almost anywhere. It would take hours to get it almost anywhere in your body. So we need it in the order of seconds, so we need to be less than half a millimeter. One thing that O2 has going for you is that it's small and nonpolar, which means that it doesn't really care about the lipid bilayer. It's going to punch through the lipid bilayer and go in and out of cells very easily. So on the other hand, it's very easy to get it into your body. The downside, of course, is that because it's small and nonpolar, it's actually hard to hold onto and transport around, and it's hard to control it entering and leaving cells. It's just going to do it very easily, and there's very little you can do once it's in the system to prevent it from doing that. And now you can begin to see why, when it began to appear on the surface of the Earth, it was such a game changer, because there was very little that cells could do to prevent themselves from interacting with it. They would either have to be in areas where it simply wasn't around, or they would have to somehow tolerate it. Okay. One thing that's also important to understand here is to supply all this oxygen, because there's a lot of material in the body, you're going to need a huge amount of surface area, right? So you're going to need to bulk up your surface area to provide enough diffusions, one, to diffuse out, but also two, to diffuse in. So you're going to have a huge amount of surface area in your lungs to provide you with enough oxygen for your body. And this other thing occasionally occurs, which is called countercurrent exchange. Countercurrent exchange can occur in other systems as well, and I will show you it in just a moment. But countercurrent exchange is where you pass high gradients across each other in opposite directions so that the gradient is maintained for as long as possible. And I'll show you what that means in just a second. Now, the simple way to do diffusion is you can be small like this guy, right? You can limit yourself, in fact, to be so small or so thin that you can just entirely rely on diffusion. So this animal can be up to a millimeter thick, right? Because on the one side, it can have oxygen diffuse on the one side down to about half a mil, and on the other side, it can have oxygen diffuse from the other direction to maybe about half a mil. So you can be up to a millimeter-ish thick, right, without an issue. That's pretty limiting for body sizes. It's still very cool. This is a large and sophisticated organism when you compare it to some of the smaller cells that are out there, but it's not nearly as complex as some of the advanced animals that we see elsewhere, right? You know that these are flatworms, are certainly not nearly as complex as those. So if you want to interact with oxygen at a larger level, you're going to need to do some other things too. So the most primitive way is the way that this flatworm does, just let it passively diffuse. And a lot of organisms still rely to some degree on this, including amphibians, which are very heavily reliant on at least some amount of just diffusion through the skin itself. Issues with this include the fact that because this surface has exposed cells, you can't have things like thick layers of lipids to protect them from drying out. So the skin has to be moist. And that means that if you're in an environment that is not wet, you're going to have real issues right away, right? You're going to be very easy to desiccate, and the cells are going to die very easily. So if we're going to go and use oxygen for other systems, we're going to need to figure out a way to get it to very large-bodied organisms. What if instead of relying just on the skin on the outside of the body, we start to fold it in on itself in a very specific area? And effectively, that's just a gill, right? We just fold it over and over and over and over in an area of the body. And now we have a huge amount of surface area for a volume that has not changed. And that is phenomenally useful, right? Gills are going to work in exactly the same way. They're going to be thin, We're going to pass some capillaries around inside of them. That's going to pick some oxygen up as the water passes over it. And we're gonna pull that oxygen into the body itself, right? That works really well. Gills are really great for water. They do, many of the aquatic organisms rely on gills to some degree. But the problem is that in the air, these very fine filaments will collapse in on themselves, and then they actually just turn into basically a sheet. So for fish that are exposed in the air, so when you catch a fish and bring it out of the water, what ends up happening is all those gill membranes collapse. And although the fish can still breathe a small amount, it still has some surface area. The surface area is decreased by hundreds of times, and it will ultimately suffocate because it simply can't get enough oxygen now. Now, this is a great way to extract oxygen, and I'll show you how fish have managed to extract even more oxygen. They rely on countercurrent exchange. But one of the advantages of moving into a more terrestrial environment is that O2 is far more plentiful in air than it is in water. In air, you're talking about 20 to 25% of the air is oxygen. In water, you're talking about tiny, teensy portions of a percent of any amount of the volume of water is actually oxygen. So you have to be much better at extracting oxygen in water, or in the case of, for instance, whales, you actually don't do that. You just go up to the surface to get your oxygen itself. All right, so fish rely on this system called countercurrent exchange. As they bring water in through the mouth, they pass it in a unidirectional flow over the gills. And the flow of the water is counter to the flow of the blood. So that if the water is flowing back towards the tail, the blood is flowing from the tail towards the head. So the capillaries point in the opposite direction within it. And this is really useful because this creates a very large gradient, and you can extract far more than 50% of the oxygen in the water. So how does that actually go about happening? All right, so look at the system on the left. That's called concurrent exchange. That is not the system that fish use. On the right is the system that the fish use. That's countercurrent exchange, and it's far more efficient. I stole these images, but they're really nicely done. Very simple, but they exchange a lot of information, so I really like them. And I wanted to credit the author down here at the bottom. So again, countercurrent exchange is what fish are using in their gills. Now, countercurrent exchange, that type of flow can be used for anything. So you could flow two systems by each other and exchange. You didn't have to be oxygen. Maybe it's sodium ions, right? You could have a countercurrent exchange with sodium ions. You could have a countercurrent exchange with heat, right? You could have a system where cold material is flowing by warm material, right? So it's just a direction of flow that the flows are an opposite to one another. But here we're going to talk about it in relation to oxygen. So look at this. This is what a gill would look like. So imagine blood. Let me get my pen out so I can circle this. Imagine blood is coming. Ooh, let me get my pen, not my highlighter. Is coming in from the heart here. And it's mostly depleted, right? It's been out to the body. So a lot of that oxygen has been removed. I know it's red, but that's because they're coloring the different directions. If you pass blood in a concurrent exchange, what you would find is that it would ultimately reach a 50-50, right? It would exchange up to half, and then it would stop exchanging because there would be no gradient. So it would exchange until the pressure of oxygen in the water going by was the same as the pressure and oxygen in the blood going by. And you saturate that at about 50%. What if we did it in the opposite direction? So notice here, the water is still flowing in this direction, but the blood is now flowing in this direction. Blood is coming in at 0 again. Notice coming from the body, so it's very depleted. And what you can see is, look at this, the water has already exchanged most of its oxygen because it's already gone by a bunch of blood. But there's still a gradient here. 5 is larger than 0, so a small amount of oxygen can diffuse. Move along again. Now there's a small amount of oxygen in the blood. This touches slightly more oxygenated water. Still a gradient, so oxygen's diffusing in. And again, you see the same thing. Look, oxygen is diffusing in. So the entire length of this gill membrane, you're exchanging oxygen in. And look, when you leave, look at how high that number is. You can get almost up to 100% saturation because you're getting a gradient almost as high, that remains able to extract oxygen in the water to the last moment at which they are in contact with each other. So this is a really useful way to exchange material. And again, it is really useful to exchange more than just oxygen, although it is useful in this case to exchange oxygen. I don't want you to think it's only used for oxygen. All right, so gills work great. We already established this. They work really well in water. There's plenty more oxygen in air. It should not surprise you then that many fish have evolved the ability to breathe air. Here's a gar, right, type of fish breathing, right? You can see it bubbling up this air, and it'll suck in more air once it pumps that out. And you know that because we already talked about the evolution of vertebrates, and I said, by the way, there's this thing called a swim bladder in fishes, which appears to be closely related to lungs, and there's that type of fish called a lungfish, which has a paired swim bladder located on the front of the chest, right? And okay, that looks a lot like a pair of lungs, and lo and behold, when you look at those through things like genetics and anatomy, they are in fact anatomically the predecessor of lungs, right? So clearly fish have been extracting oxygen from the air for a long time. Now, the main difference here will be that one group of fishes, the tetrapods, is going to switch until it's entirely reliant on terrestrial oxygen. Many other fishes are not that reliant on oxygen. However, some of them still need to breathe regularly. So if you buy a beta or a Siamese fighting fish, as they're sometimes called, at a pet store, if you prevent that fish from breathing at the surface, it will drown. They are dependent on oxygen from the air to survive. Okay, so amphibians are a primitive group of tetrapods that maintain a simpler form of breathing, and that breathing is very simple. Most amphibians don't have gills, or certainly don't have gills when they're adults. One of the things that amphibians do is they are reliant to some degree on skin breathing, so they do use that passive diffusion, and so they have a lot of capillaries in and around their skin. But they also have lungs, many of them do, I should say. And what they do is they breathe as if they were a fish gulping at food in the water. So they expand the area of their mouth, like a fish would, to suck prey into its mouth. And then they actually close their mouth and force the air from their mouth down into their lungs. This is not the way in which you breathe. This is a more primitive system, and it takes a little bit more time, right? The other thing I want you to notice here is look how undifferentiated these lungs are, right? They're basically sacs with some bumps in them. There's some additional surface area, but you would see, and you will see, that the lungs of humans are far more complex, and that's increased surface area. So this is a really good example of how evolution continues to add complexity to systems, right? You start with a simple system and you modify it. Think about how advanced this lung is relative to a flatworm, but then you can think about how advanced your lung is relative to this amphibian's lung. Amphibians are using a system that relies on this thing called positive pressure. So they are putting pressure on something to force materials around. The system you're going to rely on is negative pressure. You're going to actually create a vacuum, and that vacuum air is just going to rush to fill. And again, here's a simple amphibian lung. Look at how simple this is, right? Yes, it's a lung. Yes, there are two of them, but it's mostly honeycomb, and that's about it. You'll see when we get to the vertebrates of, I should say, mammals and birds, you'll see far more complexity there. All right, so how is mammal breathing different? This is a more efficient system. In this case, the diaphragm pulls down, right? Pulls down on the lungs. And as it does that, that creates negative pressure. So air gets sucked in through your nose, and if your mouth is open, it'll get sucked in through your mouth. And then conversely, to expel it, your diaphragm will push up, and that will push the material out of your lungs, and that will cause the material to be expelled out of your mouth. Okay? So this is a negative pressure system. The lungs also have far more surface area in things like mammals, and they have these things called alveoli. But it is still what we call tidal. And tidal means that it goes in and out the same direction. Tidal breathing, this is very similar to the way in which you had the evolution of a unidirectional pathway for feeding. Initially, you started with food going in and out the same opening, right? That's sort of tidal feeding. This is just like that, right? Except in this case, it's breathing, so it's tidal breathing. It creates dead space and it creates a lot of inefficiency because every time you breathe in, you're mixing old air with new air. You're not fully depleting all of the old air you had in your body. At least 3 to 5% of the air in your body is going to mix every time you breathe in. And it's often far more. Think in the teens or into 20 or 30%, depending on how much you're breathing in or breathing out, how shallow or how deep your breathing is. So this system is relatively inefficient. You have a lot of old air that you've already tried to extract oxygen from. Right, and this relies on negative pressure, like I mentioned before. But look at how complex the inside of a mammal lung is now. Look at, that's a human lung, right? This is preserved. The red part is a lot of the blood vessels around there. But look at all that white. Look at how these are so branching. Look at the fine structure. Look at how delicate that is. There is a huge amount of surface area locked away within those lungs. And if you zoom in, what you would see is that there are all these little tiny, what look like little tiny balls, or maybe, I don't know, they kind of look like maybe blueberries stacked together, or grapes is maybe a better way. And those little alveoli will expand and contract as air goes in and out of them. And each one of them is surrounded by these capillary beds, right? So oxygen is being extracted from there. Now the problem with tidal breathing is that you can't really have a countercurrent exchange because things are going both directions. So they go in and then they go out. So you don't have a unidirectional flow. So in mammals, you do not see that beautiful countercurrent exchange that you see in fishes. So again, yet another inefficiency built into the mammal form of breathing, and it makes mammals relatively inefficient breathers. But because you're dealing with a system that is still, again, more advanced than an amphibian, and it is in a very oxygen-rich environment, you can get away with those inefficiencies. Let's contrast that with the diapsids. Remember, diapsids are a more advanced group. The diapsids have actually managed to evolve unidirectional breathing. So when a bird breathes, it's actually breathing in a unidirectional pattern. It is not allowing air to mix, and as a result, birds are phenomenally efficient breathers. Okay? And because they're breathing in a unidirectional pattern, they are also going to use countercurrent exchange that re-evolved in this group. So diapsids have managed to modify the breathing style so that they can actually make a unidirectional system. So how do they go about doing this? Well, they have air sacs, and what happens is oxygen gets drawn into the body, gets pulled into the posterior air sacs. Those posterior air sacs will then contract and push it across the lungs towards the anterior air sacs. When the anterior air sacs fill, they will expel that material out through the body, and then another breath will be taken in. And so there is no mixing of air through that system. The air is going in one direction, and it's passing over in a countercurrent exchange. So as a reminder in Jurassic Park, never outrun the raptors. They will easily outrun you every single time. Although, to be fair, the velociraptors in Jurassic Park were like 5 or 6 times their actual size. They're more like a velociraptor would be the size of a turkey. So you could probably kick a couple of them and get away with that. I don't know if there was like 30 of them and they could get you, but you could definitely fight off a couple of turkeys if you were in good shape. One of the things that's really interesting about this too is that flight has evolved twice in the diapsids, and it may in fact be in part related to the fact that they're efficient breathers, which means they can fly at much higher altitudes, it means they can fly much longer, and it means that they have far more efficient muscles. So they are able to extract more energy per unit mass than mammals are. The other group of mammals that have taken the air that are not as efficient are bats. And actually, they've had a really hard time adapting the mammal body to flight. They've had to do things like vastly increase the surface area of their lungs. They have enormously enlarged hearts to pump much more blood within their body. Their blood actually has more red blood cells than your own, right? You can see red blood cells make up to 75% of the blood of bats, right? Remember back to our circulatory lecture? We said in a rough, for humans, we're talking about 45-ish% of the blood is red blood cells. So that's an enormous amount more of red blood cells. And red blood cells, because they are really large things, they are cells, it actually takes more energy to move them than, say, something like a liquid like plasma, okay? And they have far more capillaries in their muscles than most other mammals do. The other important thing to notice here is bats cannot fly at high altitudes. They simply cannot do it. And bats cannot migrate long distances without frequently stopping. So birds will migrate thousands of kilometers without stopping, right? They'll cross whole oceans and never stop flying. No bat on the surface of the earth migrates more than maybe a few hundred kilometers without taking a rest. They can't do it. There's also interesting things related to this bat body plan. Because they're mammals, they actually are limited by the number of offspring they can produce, because the mammal has to maintain the offspring nearby to feed it things like milk, which limits their flight. And they also, as mammals seem to tend to do, they are nocturnal, while dinosaurs tend to be diurnal, right? That system appears to be very stable. Dinosaurs, birds are very, very active during the day. Mammals, by and large, are very, very successful and active at night. All right, so let's get back to the chemistry. So fun talking about bats, but let's think about how we actually move oxygen. Well, I mentioned to you already that oxygen's hard to move around. One of the problems with it is that it is small and nonpolar, so it's hard to hold on to. And to hold on to it, in fact, we need to use something like this, a big old fat protein. And if you already know the name of the protein, it's called hemoglobin. All of us have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, at the core of it, is basically a huge amount of carbon and nitrogen that do nothing but hold on to a single iron atom. And just like I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, oxygen loves to attack iron. Your body exploits this. The reason that your blood is that slight reddish color is because it's rusty. The iron in your body literally rusts, and you get that beautifully sort of reddish brown color. Hence the reason that things like feces and urine tend to be reddish or yellowish brown, right? Those are because those are the breakdown of hemoglobin, and those colors are associated with ions and oxidation, okay? Now, vertebrates will use iron. There are some inverts will use copper. Hemoglobin, or a globin molecule, are very common in animals, so it appears to have evolved very early. In fact, it may have evolved long before protists, and it may be a protein that is useful at scavenging oxygen and protecting organisms from oxygen, and ultimately got modified to transport oxygen around the body. Hemoglobin is a really interesting compound in the vertebrates. It has these 4 groups. It's really big, and it means that you can't transport per cell. You can't actually transport very much oxygen. Every hemoglobin protein is composed of 4 different chains, and at most they can transport 4 oxygen molecules around. Look at the number of atoms that are required to move literally 8 oxygen molecules around, right? Look at how many oxygens there are bound in carbon just around the heme itself. That's not including the protein overall, right? You know what amino acid structures look like and how many oxygen and carbons are in there. So think about how many atoms of oxygen are required to move just 2 little ones that you might be able to react with, okay? So your body, again, does not need much oxygen to survive. The small amount that it does, it refreshes very frequently. This is not to say that things like nerve cells are not demanding of oxygen. It's just that the amount that they need at any one time is very low, but because your body maintains the levels in your system at fairly low levels, it has to be refreshed all the time, which means when you stop breathing, you do really run into problems very quickly. So you might be able to go without breathing for 4 or 5 minutes, which is why if you have someone who ceases to breathe, you need to begin CPR immediately. The other thing to keep in mind here is this is a reaction. It is not like a contract where you spend, oh, it's going to cost me $100 to have a car. This is more like how about I give you some amount of this money, some small amount of this money, and I can use this car for a little bit, right? The oxygen that binds to a protein, it will be liberated in the body, but what you can see here is that you're only actually maybe saturating 97 or 98% of the hemoglobin at any one time. And when it's passing around the body, you may remove 25%-ish of that, so you get down to about 75% oxygen saturation. Hence the reason if you do stop breathing, there's actually often a lot of oxygen still left in your body. In fact, the majority of your hemoglobin still have oxygen. So it's useful that the fact that the blood is not completely emptied of oxygen after one pass through the body. Think about if it were, you wouldn't be able to do things like you wouldn't be able to hold your breath. It'd actually be really hard to do vigorous activity because you couldn't up the amount of oxygen you're bringing to the muscles to compensate. So when you do really vigorous activity, you actually are in oxygen deficit, right? That number starts to creep down as you do vigorous activity, but you have a long period of time before it hits such a low level that you need to stop and recover. But it is one of the reasons, right, that you can feel out of breath, which is that you are running low on oxygen. You need to restock the amount in your blood. Something to keep in mind, though, is hemoglobin, because it's a protein, and your book makes mention of this, is that it's affected by things like pH and temperature. And concerning that, remember that one of the things that your body is making, CO2, actually has a really strong impact on pH. Temperature is also going to be strongly impacted. Remember that things that are using a lot of energy are also making a lot of waste heat. So temperature is going to be changing in and around the locations where oxygen is being offloaded. And it should not surprise you that pH and temperature change the shape of proteins, which change the binding affinity, which change the efficiency of these things, right? You've gone through and you know this because you have studied it in POB1 already. So as a reminder about pH, what is pH? pH is how acidic or how basic a solution is. A solution can be neutral, like pure water, or it can have a lot of H+ ions in it, in which case it's acidic. And you can see on the left of this scale, those numbers tend to go down. And then it can have a lot of OH negatives instead. That would make it basic. Acidic or basic things can burn you, but they are also easily detectable in your mouth. Your mouth is very, very sensitive to things like lemon juice, so it's able to take those H+ ions actually. So why does blood pH change? Well, that's a fairly straightforward reason. When you add CO2 to water, again, remember, you make an acid which gives up H+, and that makes a solution more and more acidic, right? So the CO2 that you're generating. And of course, CO2 is constantly being entering into the blood because cells are respiring and dumping their CO2 into the environment, and one of the places that ends up is blood. Before you move on, what I would recommend is this is something to do with blood. Take a look at this graph and see if you can explain it. It's similar to the graph that you see in your book on page 1014, so that's figure 48.16. So see if you can explain this graph out loud. What we can see here as we look at it, and then at this point I'm assuming you've already tried to explain the graph, as pH falls, your blood can hold actually less oxygen. This is called the Bohr effect or the Bohr shift. Okay? This appears to be a problem then. So as you make more CO2 then, exactly when you would expect to need more oxygen, right? So you can actually hold less oxygen in your blood. So why has this system evolved to be so sensitive to low pH? This is also true of temperature. As temperature increases, you can hold less oxygen. The answer is actually very simple, and it makes a lot of sense. So as muscles become more acidic, so as they produce more carbon dioxide, and as they get hotter because they're doing work, right? Work produces heat. That means that it's actually harder for the blood moving by them to hold on to its O2, and it gets dumped into the environment, right onto the muscles that need it. So actually, this is a really efficient way of making sure that blood ends up in the right place at the right time. On the left, you can just see someone working out, and you can see those really high patches of heat that are associated with energy expenditure. All right, so that covers our circulation and blood. What we'll do next is actually a system about osmoregulation. So now that we understand something about blood, we are going to also find out that blood transfers a lot of material around the body other than oxygen. And one of the things that needs to be done is things like salts need to be recovered, and byproducts, waste products other than CO2 need to be collected and then expelled out of the blood so they'll produce our urine. Again, here's another beautiful image of a preserved human. These are the kidneys, right? And look at all the blood, the arteries and veins that are part of that system.